Most people understand growth as something that increases gradually. A little more income, a slightly better outcome, small improvements over time. This creates the expectation that wealth grows in a straight line, steady, predictable, proportional to effort. But that is not how real growth behaves once systems are involved. Because systems introduce something that effort alone cannot produce: scale. Scale is what allows output to increase without requiring a matching increase in input. A person working alone is limited by time. A system is not. A business can serve 10 customers, or 100, or 1,000. And while effort may increase slightly to support that growth, it does not increase in direct proportion to the output. That difference is where scaling begins. It is the point where output starts separating from effort. A digital product can be sold repeatedly without being rebuilt each time. A platform can handle more users without multiplying labor linearly. A system can distribute value across many participants simultaneously. This is fundamentally different from labor, because labor scales poorly. More work requires more time. More output requires more effort. More income requires more participation. The relationship remains tightly connected, but systems weaken that connection. Once a system is in place, it can produce across multiple points at once, multiple transactions, multiple customers, multiple flows of value. And as those flows increase, the system begins to expand, not in a straight line, but in layers. More customers generate more revenue. More revenue supports expansion. Expansion increases capacity. And increased capacity allows even more output. This creates a feedback loop. Growth begins feeding itself. This is where most people misinterpret what they are seeing, because the visible result looks like sudden acceleration. But the acceleration was not sudden. It was built. It was the result of a system reaching a point where scale begins to take effect. In the early stages, scaling is weak. The system is small. Capacity is limited. Growth appears slow. Returns appear modest. But as the system expands, something changes. Each additional unit of growth becomes easier to achieve because the structure supporting that growth is already in place. More customers no longer require rebuilding the system. More revenue no longer requires starting from zero. The system absorbs growth instead of resisting it. And this is the beginning of acceleration, not from effort, but from structure. A structure that can expand without being rebuilt each time. This is why scaling changes outcomes so dramatically. Two people can start with similar effort, similar income, similar resources. But if one builds systems that scale and the other remains tied to linear effect, their outcomes begin to separate. At first, the difference is small. Then it becomes noticeable. And eventually, it becomes structural. Because one path increases output gradually, while the other increases capacity. And capacity is what allows growth to accelerate over time. This is the first layer of the engine, not just growth, but growth that can expand beyond the limits of effort. If this made sense to you, you already understand more than most people do. This channel exists for that kind of awareness. Like the video, subscribe. Nothing here is accidental. Scale changes how growth behaves. But scale alone is not enough. Because a system can grow and still remain limited. What determines whether it accelerates is what happens to the output it produces. This is where reinvestment enters the structure. Reinvestment is the act of taking generated value and feeding it back into the system, not extracting it, not consuming it, but redirecting it. Revenue becomes expansion, profit becomes capacity, returns become additional exposure. The output becomes new input. And that is what begins to change the speed of growth. Without reinvestment, growth stays limited. A system produces value, and that value leaves. The structure remains the same size. The capacity does not expand. So each cycle starts from the same level again. Growth repeats, but it does not compound. Reinvestment breaks that pattern. Instead of resetting after each cycle, the system builds on the previous one. More capital increases reach. More reach increases output. More output creates more capital. The system begins layering itself. One cycle feeds the next. The next expands the system. The expanded system produces more. And this creates a loop. Not a stable loop, but an expanding one. Each rotation increases the size of the system. Each cycle produces more than the last. At first, the difference is small, because the base is small. Reinvesting a small amount produces a small change. But as the base grows, the impact of reinvestment grows with it. The same percentage applied to a larger base produces a larger result. And those larger results are then reinvested again. This is where acceleration begins to appear. Not because the system changed, but because the scale of reinvestment increased. More capital flows back into the system, more capacity is created, more output is generated. And the loop continues, but faster. This is the mechanism behind exponential growth. Not a sudden event, but a process where reinvestment keeps expanding the base. And as the base expands, each cycle becomes more powerful than the last. This is why reinvestment is often underestimated, because it delays consumption, it delays visible reward. The system grows, but the individual does not immediately feel the benefit, which is why many people extract too early. They consume the output instead of feeding it back into the structure. And when that happens, the system stops expanding. Growth stabilizes. Acceleration never begins. But when reinvestment is maintained, the system continues increasing its own capacity. It builds on itself. And that is where the second layer of the engine becomes visible. Not just growth, but growth that feeds itself. A structure that becomes larger each time it operates. And as that structure expands, so does the speed at which it produces results. At a certain point, the system begins to behave differently. Not because the strategy changed, but because the scale did. The structure is now larger. The flows are now stronger. The output is no longer small enough to ignore. This is where acceleration becomes visible, not as a sudden spike, but as a shift in how growth feels. Earlier, progress was incremental. Each cycle produced a small increase. Each reinvestment added only modest expansion. Now, each cycle produces a noticeably larger outcome, because the system is no longer operating from a small base. It is operating from accumulated structure. And accumulated structure changes everything. More capital moves through the system. More capacity exists inside it. More output is generated each time it runs. Reinvestment feeds that structure again, and the cycle continues. But now, the impact of each cycle is amplified, because each reinvestment is larger. Each expansion is more meaningful. Each outcome compounds on a stronger foundation. This is when growth stops feeling linear. It begins to feel uneven, accelerated, sometimes disproportionate to the original effort. And this is where most people misinterpret what they are seeing. They assume the acceleration is sudden. They assume something changed overnight. But nothing changed suddenly. The system was building the entire time, quietly, consistently, layer by layer, cycle by cycle, reinvestment after reinvestment, until the structure reached a point where growth could no longer remain small. This is the phase where wealth begins to separate outcomes dramatically. Two systems that once looked similar no longer produce similar results, because one remained limited while the other continued expanding. The expanding system now produces more output with each cycle, and that output is still being reinvested, which means the next cycle will be even larger. This is acceleration, not from effort, not from intensity, but from structure reaching a scale where it feeds itself efficiently. And once that phase begins, it becomes difficult to reverse. Because the system now carries momentum. Momentum built from time, from repetition, from disciplined reinvestment. This is the final layer of the engine, a system that no longer depends on constant external input because it generates its own. Capital produces more capital. Systems expand themselves. Growth sustains growth. And wealth, at that point, stops being a target. It becomes a byproduct of a structure that continues operating whether attention is placed on it or not. Quietly, consistently, driven not by moments of effort, but by systems that were allowed to grow, scale, and feed themselves over time. If this changed how you see growth, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something.